Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for making it on this very hot summer's day in London, and I'm sure in the US as well. Um, to When We Win, Writing Our Futures. My name is Junlin Go. I am one of the co-founding directors of Migrants in Culture, which is a migrant-led art and design studio for social movements. So, alongside visual design services for social movement organizers, we also offer a creative and embodied training program for migrant organizers and organizations called Saturday School. And Saturday School is a place where organizers for the last 4 years and counting have been exploring creative practices, including speculative sci-fi writing, politicized somatics, design and drawing, and conflict transformation as ways of building creativity and resilience in their practice. And in particular, our sci-fi strand has been supporting organizers to use fiction, sci-fi, and speculative fiction as a way of exercising our muscles to vision alternatives and to embolden our strategies as collective movements. So we're really blessed to have Yara and Ama who are teaching this year as part of Saturday School. And we're really excited to, as part of Saturday School, have this online talk and to also have Farhaana and Eman in this conversation about the need and necessity and actually the pleasure of envisioning the world if we won. So thank you, Ama, Eman, Farhaana, and Yara for being part of this conversation. And I'm going to pass over to Farhaana, who's sharing this conversation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Junlin and Migrants and Culture, for hosting this conversation, which I'm so excited for. We're going to be talking about how create the kind of role of creative writing in social movement building and organizing, and also the role of political organizing in how we write creatively and imagine a world where we won. So I'm really excited to be joined by Eman, Ama, and Yara today. We're going to start the conversation with a few readings from each of our panelists' work. So we'll begin with Eman Abdelhadi. Um, uh, who is a scholar and organizer and writer based in Chicago. She's an assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. Her manuscript, Impossible Futures: Why Women Leave Muslim Communities, is forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press. She co-wrote the revolutionary sci-fi novel Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune 2052 to 2072, which was published by Common Notions Press in 2022, which has been translated into French and Catalan. Eman co-edited a volume entitled Muslim Engagement with Gender and Sexuality, which is forthcoming with Brill, and a Queer Palestine special issue of Pinko magazine published in 2024. She guest edited a special issue of Public Humanities called Palestine as Paradigm: How Gaza Transformed the World, which is also forthcoming. She writes a regular column on Palestine and politics for In These Times magazine. And she is the subject of Coming Around, a feature-length documentary on the intersection between sexuality and religion. A long-time organizer in the movement for Palestinian liberation, she is active in Scholars for Justice, faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine, and the AAUP at the University of Chicago. So Eman, over to you. If you could tell us a little bit about your work and read from some of it.
Thank you so much, Farhana. And it's so exciting to be here with all of you. Also, a hot day in Chicago. It's 90 degrees, which I know probably means nothing in this space. I have no idea what that means according to the rest of the world, but hot. Think hot. So yeah, that what I'm reading from is actually an excerpt from Everything for Everyone, which was the sci-fi novel a speculative fiction novel co-written with Michelle O'Brien that came out in 2022. And it's exciting because it's exciting being here with Ama because one of the projects that I've been working on these last couple of years is an anthology called When We Win. So that's definitely on all of our minds. So it's coming out with Haymarket Books this time next year. And yeah, so it's called When We Win, Dispatches from Revolutionary Futures. And we asked movement writers, movement intellectuals, organizers, and writers that we really love and respect to write along this theme. And we were really, really honored to have Ama join us. So it's really cool to be here in this space with her and with all of you. The chapter that I'm reading from today is the second chapter of Everything for Everyone. In the novel, each chapter is a fictional oral history interview that takes place in the future. So the imagined conceit is that I'm interviewing someone whose last name is Hassan, and I'm asking them about their participation in the final Intifada and the liberation of Palestine. Again, this came out in 2022. So I ask Hassan, tell me about the final Intifada. And they say it was a mass insurrection that started in the early 30s and ended with the liberation of Palestine in 38. People were rising up all over Palestine in 48 and in the West Bank. Skipping ahead here a little bit. What do you think made the final Intifada different from the first three? Hassan says, two things. First, there was a lot more pressure from 48. It wasn't just the West Bank rising. That had started to happen in the 20s, that you saw more agitation in 48. The second and more important thing was pressure on the Israeli state. In the 20s, you had massive boycotts of Israel by individuals, companies, universities, and industries all over the world. Those got stronger and stronger until the main holdout was really only the US government. But by 2030 in the US, shoring up Israel had become unpopular. By the mid-30s, it had become financially impossible. No more money for surveillance, for the military, for all the fancy weapons that came from the US. That, plus the market crashes, spelled the end for the Dawla. How are the market crashes affecting things? I asked. Horribly, similar to everywhere. The state couldn't afford to keep up the luxuries they gave to working class and middle class Jews because the global economy was faltering. So no more free healthcare or free housing for new settlers, none of that. That really brought down buy-in for the whole Zionist project. And of course, it upped the insurrectionary pressure from Palestinians, who were literally starving. Okay, so what happened when you crossed the border? They say, when we got into Gaza, I reached out to a distant cousin who lived there, Ahmed. Ahmed was amazing. He'd been living with his katiba, that was a small resistance militia or brigade. They were living in an old UN school that had been shelled and hollowed out. Only the outside wall survived, and they built a little tent city inside. When we got there, they welcomed us in. People really familied their kataib because so many families were broken from the shelling. Skipping ahead a little bit. I say, what were you plotting? They say, resistance. Like? You know, guerrilla ops, mostly targeting the border to Gaza. There was a sense that if we could break the geographic hold, they wouldn't have a chance to control us. Our strength was always in numbers, and that's why they had separated us into different groups. We were opening the prison gates, the border to Gaza. We knew we couldn't form a big army. Too much surveillance for that. Too easy to bomb the shit out of wherever we were gathering. It always had to happen in small groups. I think that model really influenced the communes later, how everything had to be local first. You had to know who you were dealing with. There had to be trust. You were accountable not to some big anonymous state, but to like your actual neighbors and housemates. Definitely. It took a year of intense planning and coordinating with resistance fighters across Palestine, but eventually the border between Gaza and the rest of Palestine fell. The IDF couldn't hold out between the mass defections, the international condemnations, the weapons and supplies drying up. I say, tell me about the day the border fell. And Hassan pauses for a long time. It was the most beautiful day of my life. There had been marches, so many marches. There was a sense that as a movement, we had tried guerrilla warfare on its own and it hadn't worked. So there had to be both a military presence and just mass uprising. People in Kataib would work on bombing the borders, blowing up military outposts and all that. But most people were just organizers, and they'd work on the marches. The marches were like big fucking parties. It's where everyone let out steam from the stress of the random bombings, the stress of the raids, all of it. We cried and we sang and we danced. The Debka lines were bigger than you'd ever seen. There was a big march that day. It was supposed to be the biggest one, but people were worried. Worried that everyone was getting tired of being out and about all the time. We worried no one would show up. But then the Israelis, they attacked a school bus that morning. They straight up shot up this bus, killed all the kids on their way to school. This photo went up on ours of the bus in tatters, bits of flesh everywhere. It was horrifying. And everyone came the fuck out. Like seriously, all of Gaza marched that day. At least 1 million people marched to the border. We stood there and the army started shooting at us. And we started shouting, more will come. More will come. More will come. Because it was true. More would come. It was literally do or die. The soldiers were overwhelmed and kind of backing up. They had no real strategy. Ours was to do what we had always done as Palestinians. Refuse to stop existing. Refuse to disappear. Those of us that were armed started shooting at them. Some people made Molotov cocktails. And of course they shot at us. But when our shuhada would fall, more would come. They couldn't stop us. They started to see that. This woman got on the mic, a comrade. I forget her name. She was killed a few days later. She grabbed this megaphone and started shouting in English, drop the gun and run. It became a chant and everyone picked it up. Hundreds of thousands chanting at these soldiers, drop the gun and run. And eventually they did. They dropped their guns and they ran. And to tell you the truth, we didn't run after them because it wasn't about them. It was about us. How big and beautiful we were in that moment. How unstoppable. We knew that we had done what our parents and grandparents had dreamt of doing. We knew that nothing would ever be the same. They were what Darwish had called them, abirun, passers-by. Us, Palestine, that was forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eman. There's so much to talk about there. We'll definitely get onto it. For everyone attending and listening, I mean, if that hasn't inspired you to read the work, I don't know what will, but it's just so amazing. I also just want to kind of say that the introduction to the work where you set out the kind of like premise of the book, I think just even on a kind of affective level, it is so inspiring, and that's like really the word. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking more about that. Our next panelist is Yara Rodrigues Fowler. Sorry, it keeps taking me a while to get up the bios. Yara Rodrigues Fowler is the author of 2 novels, Stubborn Archivist, published in 2019, and There Are More Things, published in 2022. Her novels have been nominated for various prizes, including the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Desmond Elliott Prize, the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction, and the Goldsmiths Prize for Experimental Fiction. In 2023, Yara was named one of Grant's Best Young British Novelists in their Once a Decade list. She is currently completing a PhD at the University of Leeds on abolitionist approaches to the novel form. So Yara, over to you.
Hello, I'm going to read from There Are More Things, which came out in 2022 as well. So just for a bit of context, this is a novel that takes place partly in 2016, 2017 in London, and then there's a narrative that takes place in the late 60s, early 70s during the military dictatorship in Brazil. And yeah, I think that's all the explaining that I'll do. So this is from the very start of the historical part. Pedaço de mim, 1969 to 74. 1. A woman at the side of the road with no bag on her back. Tall. Her skin is light brown, young, chin high. A woman in a blue Beetle car with dark hair around her face and her foot on the pedal. Her skin is worn out white. The nighttime is purple. Get in. You will drive. I'll drive. How far? 200 kilometers, 300 tomorrow. To where? A safe house. Where? West of here, no interior de Pernambuco. You have said goodbye to everyone. I have. The woman in the driver's seat starts the engine. She says, "What should I call you?" Clytemnestra. What? Clytenke? I cannot call you that. It's not even Brazilian. What is it? It's an ancient name from Greece. Greece? No, you cannot. Why not? You know why not. You must have a name that disappears just as you must disappear. A name that dissolves in the air after it is spoken. Maria or Erna. If you want, you may make it diminutive, like Aninha. If the great communist leader Carlos Marighella can be Professor Menezes, why can I not be? Carlos Marighella was killed. What? It happened yesterday. No, it's a lie. It's always a lie, to demoralize us. Open the glove compartment. That is today's newspaper. Morto o chefe terrorista Marighella. There is a picture of his body inside. You will have to be Maria or Erna. Silence. Inside the car is dark. The woman in the driver's seat turns the steering wheel. I carry his writings with me everywhere. Marighella? Yes. Clytemnestra wipes her face with the back of her hand. Why did you want this name, Clytemnestra? She was a warrior, killer of kings. You want to kill kings, I believe, in revolution. The woman with her hands on the steering wheel looks at her. I can call you Clytemnestra, but only when we are alone. Clytemnestra looks at her. But you must respond to Maria in public. Clytemnestra nods. The other woman smiles. Clytemnestra, killer of kings. They hit a bridge. The traffic around them slows. On the other side is a military blockade. A young man with close-cropped hair, military police, holds a gun the length of his torso. He looks ahead at them, and they look at him through the windows of the car, black boots. Clytemnestra, killer of kings, says, Merda, merda. Do not worry, they will not stop us. Isha, do not worry. It's the police, their boots. Don't worry, breathe. They pass through the blockade, glide, into the outskirts of the city, bad housing. The woman in the driver's seat sits back. She pulls the wig of black hair from her head, revealing short brown hair underneath. For the first time, Clytemnestra, killer of kings, sees her properly, her mouth and eyes and nose illuminated and then dark, illuminated and then dark again in the headlights of passing cars. And Clytemnestra, killer of kings, says, Menina. And Clytemnestra, killer of kings, is speaking, turning her body in her seat, her hands on the dashboard, Carlos Marighella's dead body on the newspaper sheets falling to the floor of the car. You were the governor's daughter. You are the famous revolutionary. I did not recognize you in your black wig, but it is you. Is it true what the newspaper said? That you killed one of the military police right in the center of the forehead? Bang. Is that why you are running? I know your name. I've read it in the newspaper. How is your father? He's a good man. I know your name. And Clytemnestra, killer of kings, is saying the other woman's name. She shouts it. Laura. Laura, the famous revolutionary, exhales, foot on the pedal. She looks at the young woman to her right.
Thanks so much, Yara. Again, just so looking forward to talking about it more. There's something that, it's so beautifully written and was beautifully read as well. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you particularly about kind of the role of experimentation in helping us to imagine different worlds. So yeah, I'm looking forward to talking more as well. Our final panelist is Ama Josephine Budge Johnstone, who is a British Ghanaian speculative writer, artist, curator, and pleasure activist who explores the kinships between Blackness, feminism, decolonial aesthetics, queer erotics, and ecology to form a praxis that she has named Intimate Ecologies, working toward Black liberatory and interspecies futures. Ama, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be sharing this speculative space with all of you and to have my work swimming in this space, this virtual, possible, impossible space with yours, Eman and Yara. I saw the comment about requesting a content notice, so I think that the only content notice for my reading is descriptions of ecocide. I'm going to read from the beginning of, I'm going to just think about that a little more. Content notices are always difficult because you don't know what a content notice for whom. But I think that will do for now. And actually, I would love it if you would tell me if there is another content notice that I should have made at the end. Anyone in the chat? So this, I'm going to read from the beginning of my short story, V for Futuring, which is in When We Win, the anthology coming out next year. And I'm not going to say anything about it beforehand, except that I really like it. And I was rereading it, and I really I don't always feel like I go back to my work and go, oh, I should have done this, or this wasn't quite there, but I was really enjoying reading this, so I'm really excited to share it with you. So I said, this is from the beginning. Dear V, as I sit here writing this, watching you undulate before me, all the abundant possibilities of the world you might go on to inhabit overwhelm me. It's hard to know where to begin, to know where exactly our story starts, yours and mine. You are an outrageous impossibility, an unflinching fantasy, the shared raving of a motley crew of intimate strangers, the mirage we've each given up everything to follow, the intangible matter of our dreaming. I want to imprint a sense of myself here for you to find on these pages. I hope to spend every morning for the rest of my life placing the soft intention of my lips to the sweet mystery of your brow. But, if nothing else, these past few years have taught me that anything, everything can change in a matter of moments. I want you to know that you were wanted, were loved before you even came into existence. And, despite all the amorphous ephemera surrounding your inception, I want you to know that you are mine. My blood, bone, guts, and marrow, my gristle between your teeth, my calluses cushioning your feet. And I am yours. You might read these letters in the order they were written, but you don't have to. They are supposed to equip you with some general knowledge of the world out there, the one that's dying now, as well as the worlds we're hoping to build, the ones that depend on your survival, on your thriving. No pressure, right? Don't worry, if you're already reading these letters, then we've already achieved the incredible. The rest is just sediment and topsoil and the breadth of your dreaming. Our job is nourishing a world where your dreams can be seeded, can take root, can unfurl through an ecology so much more expansive than the ones we've left behind. Your job is just to live. Please, please live. Yet I find myself reluctant to speak of that world, its wars and betrayals, its violence and its cruelty. You'll have to forgive me if I skate over some of the details a little. I'll try to give you everything you need to understand how we got here, how I chose this. And this is only my version of the story. Other people's letters may be more frank or less honest. But the way I see it, the world was always going to end, that world was always going to end in catastrophe. And it's the new worlds growing up all around us that I think about, the ones evolving right here and those beyond the borders of our island. From pole to pole, peoples have committed to trying new, old ways, have committed to trying. For now, the heat, cloying and possessive, dominates our every waking and sleeping moment. Each day, more and more of the ocean's secrets whisper between salt-encrusted toes as we mark the tide line further and further in. The sea is at once alive with a plethora of flirtatiously bizarre aquatic amoeba that continue to adapt to the water's high radiation levels, and at the same time awash with funereal processions of the fish and mammals that haven't made it. Mostly they're small, a shriveled kaleidoscope of angelfish, surgeonfish, red-spotted tang, and unicorn fish, the occasional monk seal or sea turtle. But last month, a pod of 9 false killer whales washed up on the other side of the island. There was nothing false about their own killing, about their deaths. Leia remembered the graceful, mournful bodies of 157 of these sharp-toothed black dolphins arriving in her home near Arthur River. Her parents had been part of the Tasmanian refloating endeavours that finally failed. I imagined small pockets of humans heaving and heaving the ungainly weight of flesh and fin, trying to convince them to swim back out into the depths, dismayed as they lolled listlessly back to the beach over and over again, refusing to choose life, like they already knew what was coming. No one could say why they had come ashore, melancholy future ghosts, messengers from some shadow realm or another. I remember the images from my own childhood of a minke whale moored on the beaches of Ireland. I remember people were told to stay away from its mottled, decomposing body, as though keeping our distance might dissuade its portents from holding true, from sticking to the whorls of our hands and the soles of our feet. We each carried a piece of these creature kin with us, rotting in our pockets. We showed them to each other with our eyes closed, caressed their edges with the corners of our mouths when our parents weren't looking. We already knew their world was dying. We cradled its dead in our unformed palms, talismans and tokens to the futures we would world instead. They are all a part of what got me here, those totems of death and possibility. They left me susceptible to take a chance on an impossibility. They led me to you. Although the aesthetics seem apocalyptic, this graveyard of the past offers a plethora of gifts. Not only abundant feasting for the crabs, seabirds, and small insects that inhabit our coastline, but also delivering a rich array of scales, teeth, bones, stings, and other bodily accoutrements that Nancy hoards, insisting on their endless uses and indescribable value. I confess I find it somewhat morbid, but also perhaps appropriate. In the Neolithic period, many peoples buried their loved ones under their hearthstones at the heart of the home. I've always kind of loved that idea. As we sit here ensconced in all our dreaming and lofty imaginings, it's important we don't forget our dead. The multi-species ancestors whose dreaming ended with them, the ghosts we must honour in the ecologies we go on to ferment. A world, this island, yours and mine, our living and our dead, cohabiting together. I began by saying I was feeling overwhelmed, didn't I? Well, I suppose I'm easily overwhelmed these days. The hormones flood my body with watery affectations, easily swayed by this or that. A fleeting thought might explode onto the stage, grab up my mood, my way of viewing things, and run off with it, beyond the realms of reason or perspective. I wonder if these letters will feel like they were written by many different people, many different me's. It is strange, I suppose, to feel so overrun, so invaded by emotion, taken over and inhabited by waves of feeling that are at once my own and not my own, when you are growing outside of my body. We did look at in utero gestation from the start, but it was just too uncontrolled an environment for the kinds of monitoring and influence required to keep you alive. And that was clearly our priority, the nexus that has brought us all together. You, convincing you to choose life. I've spent some time mourning that decision, wishing I could know what it might feel like to house 2 hearts beating instead of 1. 2 livers, 2 small intestines, but I know others were relieved to escape the biological necessity for reproductive parasitism. It's never been for everyone, this practice of 2 bodies, one still unknown, ever hungry, insatiable in its insistence to take all you have, sometimes more than you can give, each growing and remaking one another into new forms, shapes, and functions. Yet here that choice was in many ways out of my hands. The scientist in me soothes those other mourning voices. Besides, that is an essential part of the symbiosis, the reciprocity, the exchange. We'll get most of the influence once you're out and walking around, so it's only fair we take a back seat at this stage. Allow your other parent to mold you into being too. The sentient seaweed holds your being now in ways that I cannot. So why the mood swings? The hormones overloading my system are responding to a simulated artificial embryo that was implanted the same day you were seeded into your green, living womb. Various fluids and tissues are harvested from my body and fed into your incubator. Sometimes I dream of these conjoinings as a kind of erotic encounter, an exchange of fluid and feeling. Fleshy green tentacles wrap around my mind, nebulous and many-gendered, filling my subconscious with the smell of brine and the feeling of being taken over, stretched taut and made new. Our interspecies love affair happens in the warped corner of the mirror, in the reflections of light on water, rehearsals of the play we long to perform, an imitation of a kinship we don't yet know how to name. So much of this process is a simulation, like a false killer whale, except that it's not false either. It's real, a real life, yours and mine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ama. It so makes sense what you said before reading that about how you really enjoyed rereading that. And actually, when I was reading the story, and I think we could also tell from the way that you read it was so obvious that you'd had so much fun writing it, which reminds me of what you said, Junlin, at the beginning about how creative writing also brings, has an element of pleasure, which is also politically significant. So yeah, thank you all three of you for your beautiful readings. To kind of start off the conversation, just a really open question, which is how each of you consider the role of creative writing in political organizing and vice versa as well. So how political organizing informs your creative writing. Does anyone want to go first, or should we kind of maybe just go in the order that the readings were?
I'd be up for going first, which
Yep.
maybe also is the same
Go
other
for it.
option. Yeah, I've been thinking and talking about this and writing about it a lot because, I am an organizer and have been an organizer much longer than I've been a fiction writer. And I think that, on the left, for the last few decades, we've gotten so used to losing, and I think that there was a moment where it felt like winning was kind of besides the point, where we got to the point where it was just about doing something, right? So I've been in organizing meetings where people are like, let's do a picket, and I'm like, okay, of whom, for what? Like, what is our strategy? Like, what's our long-term goals? And I think that, I think being able to, and I think that organizing to win is about being able to envision a future, right? So I think a lot about the introduction to Octavia's Brood, which was an anthology of like political science fiction that Adrienne Marie Brown and Harsha Willia co-edited. And they say all organizing is speculative fiction, right? So when we go, when we're on the street and we're saying free Palestine, like that is us speculating a future, right? That is us imagining a reality that does not yet exist, right? And I think that taking that a step further to say, okay, how do we get from A to Z, right? How do we get to that outcome that we're speculating in slogans, that we're speculating in the street? And writing Everything for Everyone kind of forced me to think through so much of my theory of change, right? And my theory of the world, and my theory of revolution. And that's not about, sometimes people read the book or they come to an event and they're like, so what do we do? And it's not about creating a blueprint. It's not so much about saying, well, now Everything for Everyone is a blueprint for the future. It's not, right? But it's rather about exercising the muscle of thinking about winning, and thinking about what winning would take and imagining. And that needs to be an active exercise, right? So if of being able to come back and revise the way that we revise writing, right? To say like, okay, so we thought we'd win this thing by doing this thing, and actually it turns out we can't, and so we need to re-envision. And so to me, they're two like sides of the same coin, and they really mutually support each other. This type of writing, this type of imagining that can shape how we do organizing. And then what we learn in organizing also shapes the writing, because everything in Everything for Everyone, everything in When We Win, I think is effectively us reflecting back to movements, the visions that we've learned on the street and in organizing, and in these conversations, right? The movement says Free Palestine, and then we might write it up as a chapter. So yeah, those are my first thoughts on that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, it so comes through in the writing, and I think what you said about both informing the other is so true about how political organizing is already speculative, and also that in so many organizing spaces we don't exercise that muscle of imagining that there is going to be a future when we will have organized to win, and that will have happened. And so it completely makes sense that to exercise that muscle in creative writing will then feed back into how we organize and how we feel while we're organizing. Yara, I'd love to hear what you think on the question, and specifically around your creative writing, and as I said earlier, the role of experimentation in that.
Yeah. So I guess for context, I've been an organizer for about a decade and a novelist for about a decade. And I've also worked as an organizer, sort of like a paid organizer, like trained in kind of community organizing and like worker organizing methods, as well as like direct action, and most recently organizing writers for BDS, basically. So we had quite a big campaign in the UK around divestment for this asset manager to divest, because Baillie Gifford, who was sponsoring the most prominent UK literary festivals, and by using worker organizing methods. Sorry, everyone's frozen. Have I frozen for you?
Yeah, but I can still hear you, so.
Okay, I think you're
Oh,
back.
you're back now as well. Yeah.
So yeah, by using worker organizing methods rather than traditional kind of appealing to the morality of the bosses. We didn't appeal to the morality of the bosses. We withdrew our labor in a really tight way, and that is what forced divestment. They were never convinced, and they're still not. So yeah, for context, that's and on the academic or the literary side, I guess I come from more of like a literary studies approach. And I'm much more ambivalent about the relationship between creative writing and organizing, partly because I have tried to organize people who do creative writing for a living. And, they weren't full of wisdom at all. Actually, they were really difficult to organize. A lot of them are really nihilist, even the ones who post about Palestine every day on their Instagrams. They're not necessarily up for going to the meeting and filling in the spreadsheet and doing the admin. And that's what it takes to win, right? Like Eman, I'm sure you know that as well. It's not just being a hero. It's not just writing poetic words. It's doing this like boring, pragmatic, time-consuming work, which means that you're spending less time with your partner, less time at the gym, less time on your own writing in your career. So I, and so I think I feel much more ambivalently about what creative writing can bring to organizing, because for me, it's been much more clear that the lessons of organizing are really, really important to bring to writers as workers. And my message to most writers who are supportive of Palestine is write less, organize more, actually. Like to join your union. That's probably my message to them. Having said all of that, Um, and I also think, just again, like coming from a literary studies point of view, I have a little bit of a gripe with this phrase that all organizing is science fiction. All organizing is speculative and all fiction is speculative. That's inherent to what fiction is, right? Even some memoirs are speculative. I was reading a memoir the other day where a woman recounts a conversation she had with her father when she was 7. She doesn't actually remember it. So there's a speculative element there. And not all speculation is anti-imperialist or socialist or whatever. So, there's a sort of sci-fi element to what Elon Musk does. So I think, all of these categories are much more kind of ambivalent politically and morally, which doesn't mean we can't instrumentalize them in really exciting ways. We absolutely can. But yeah, I think that's more the perspective, I guess, that I have. So yeah, having said all of that, in terms of my practice, I think, I'm a kind of old school Marxist. I think what's really, what I what I'm really interested in is history. And I think that for us to understand the contingency of the present moment, how can the mode of production, how can imperialism, etc., be transformed? We need to understand that it's contingent in the first place, and it wasn't always like this. So it's quite interesting to me actually that Eman's piece and mine in a way did quite similar things, but I was reaching back in history to expand the political horizon, whereas Eman was reaching forward. But my aim with that novel was to take these two characters, one from Brazil and one from the UK, who both grew up in these moments of, quote unquote, the end of history with centre-left governments taking power, Lula in Brazil, New Labour in the UK, and then suddenly there's the financial crash, and suddenly there's the rise of fascism again. And all of these things that you were told about how things will only get better, etc., aren't true. And I wanted to use the novel, the realist novel, to create a moment of time travel for the reader. So no one actually time travels in the novel, but you have 2016 placed right next to 1969 in Brazil. And the point of doing that was to say, look, even within living memory, socialism was such a threat. Socialism in the global south was such a threat that dictatorships were established, empires mobilized to stop it. So it was, again, it's a form of speculation because it's fictional, but it's reaching into the past. And yeah, I think particularly for readers in the global north, there is a real risk that we don't know our history, we don't know the history of the global south. So I think there's a sort of a place for that kind of historical role that fiction can play. And I did a lot of work with historical materials, like using the Brazilian government's Truth Commission report that they did into Crimes of the Dictatorship to write that section. There's this amazing resource that I used, which was, so basically what happens in that section is they go to this liberated zone in the forest that was established by communists. But what happened is it's like if, we got some AK-47s and decided to establish a liberated zone. They were, not people that were really equipped to be doing that. But the diary of one of the commanders who was out there was seized by the military police eventually. But there's a journalist in 2011 who leaked it online. So I was using that, and there were wonderful details in it, like we all have diarrhea because we're not used to eating cashew milk. So it gave it that kind of texture. So I think on the one hand, like there's this really important lesson that history can teach us about contingency, and fiction can do an enormous job of bringing that to life. So on the one hand, it's Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed can teach us about anarchism in theory, but also knowing that in Rojava right now, they are doing a version is really important as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess it goes both ways, and I feel deeply ambivalent. And sorry, there was one more thing, which is you asked about form. So I guess like part of the reason that I use an experimental form is to use the novel as a way of rehearsing social formation. So the novel is always a way of rehearsing social formation. And so when we unmake and remake the form of the novel, and what can that show us in terms of how we can make and unmake the social forms that we live with every day. So that's kind of my approach to formal experimentation as well. I'll stop there.
So much. That definitely does answer the question. And thanks so much for also outlining that ambivalence, because I think that there is a real risk actually, and it's quite, I wouldn't say prevalent, but it's the kind of almost standard liberal framing, which is that literature and writing in itself is somehow kind of politically effective or something, or that the practice of writing in itself is a way of making the world better, which is actually just it's not that's not a radical position at all, and it's as you've outlined, it's not how it bears out, and it completely makes sense that it's actually very difficult to organize people who think that they're already doing all of the politics just by writing, and that's really not enough. So, but thank you also for bringing in the dimensions of how they can actually inform each other, and the fact that they don't necessarily always inform each other, but when you bring them together, it can really help to make our organizing more effective. Yeah, Ama, would you like to answer the same question about how creative writing informs your organizing and vice versa?
Yes. I think that I mean, specifically thinking about speculative writing, which, I think is useful because as Yara says, the word speculative, there's speculative economics. It's not inherently doing anything particularly radical, but I think can be, and I think terms do need to be defined and situated, right? I mean, like, in terms of what we mean and who we're speaking with and for. And I do think that for some people, in some places, writing is in and of itself an incredibly radical act. And we know that because it is not possible for lots of people in lots of places, and their writing is consistently taken away and banned and made illegal and etc. etc. I do think there is still, yeah, I wouldn't blanket agree with that statement. But I think that speculative writing changes the landscape upon which I see organizing happen. And, when I first came up in kind of frontline organizing in my early 20s and early BLM UK spaces, I really struggled with, or I came to struggle later with this feeling that you're constantly reacting to the moves on a board that has been set by someone else, and they're always 3 moves ahead, and we always almost seem to be reacting in the past. We're almost like our actions are already, that the headlines are already written about what we did. Before we did it, before we went through all the administrative labor of doing it. And I felt incredibly overwhelmed and distraught, I think, by this feeling locked in this sense of temporality that felt inescapable. And where we were performing a kind of pre-set choreography of what resistance could look like. And I think I think that's also generational. I think that's also about kind of coming up in times of marching against, seeing like the march against the Iraq War and seeing nothing happen, and seeing this consistent showing up and going out in 2020 and 2021, and seeing the massive slide back of an increase of anti-blackness that we knew intellectually was coming, but it's still, my God, it hurts. And I think, makes it more difficult to go out and out and out again, and to feel like you're not just going out for yourself to feel better, right? All of that to say that I think, and I wrote this down because I wanted to be concise, and I'm not being concise because I'm thinking about all the things that everybody's just said, but what I wrote down is that speculative fiction writing and teaching speculative fiction, because I think it's also about teaching, facilitating spaces with folks who don't normally write, especially, challenges for me the ways in which the far right don't see us as a part of their future, right? We're either not in the future, their actions are to explicitly eradicate us from the future, or to have us only existing in the future in this kind of position of abject labor and extract as an extractable resource, as a sacrificial zone. So speculative writing helps me to rethink the timescales that we're building toward. not only in the future, but also in the past. And what that means is that the allies that I'm looking to, the comrades that I'm calling on are my descendants and my ancestors, and we're all organizing against the same fight across all these different times, which means that the idea of when we win isn't necessarily, doesn't need to be in my lifetime for it to matter. And it's not quantifiable anyway in my lifetime because the timeline of change is not a linear European colonial timeline. It is something that's far more amorphous and far more adaptive. So I'm conspiring across time and across space as well as across geographies to overthrow this white supremacist, ecocidal, heteronormative, racist, capitalist patriarchy. And I think that when I feel locked into a present in which I have so little power, which is not true, I don't have little power, but when I feel that way, shifting my sense of the breadth of the front line that's moving with me across time and the scale and scope of the futures that we're moving into and building really shifts me out of this kind of capitalist timescape, which is this I make one move, you make three moves choreography, and into something that forces me to not just intellectually talk about other ways of being and doing, not just intellectually talk about what it might mean to build a future in which humans are not the most important species on the planet, and what that might mean we have to give up or invite in or return to, but actually think about how that translates into my everyday living, loving, reproducing practice.
Thank you so much. I think that really, really touches on something which we've maybe been kind of scouting around but not quite landed on, which is that that actually imagining these futures is very empowering, and it kind of does return that sort of agency over what future we will live in back to us. It reminds me of there's an indigenous writer in the US called Kyle White, I think. Yeah, Kyle White, who published an article in 2018, I think, about, it's called Indigenous Science Fiction and the Anthropocene, or for the Anthropocene. And they talk about how we're already living in a future that was speculated by someone and it just wasn't us. And so yeah, so I think that, I guess, speculative fiction can return that power to us of sort of like the future could be what we want it to be instead of the future that others have imagined for us. So yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I guess for the next question, to kind of like move on to sort of like more the sort of speculative aspects of it, what do you think are the ingredients that we need to be able to get to that future where we win, and how does that kind of come out in your creative writing practice as well? Should we go with Aman again?
Sure. Yeah, I first just want to say that I learned a lot from Yara and Ama's responses, and I feel really grateful to be in conversation. And I'm thinking a lot about what you said, Yara, about the sort of value neutrality of speculation, like on its own, right? That it's not inherently liberatory, which to me kind of brings up the question that you just asked, Farhaana, which is like, what is it that makes it liberatory? And I really like this reference to this idea that we're living in a future where that capitalists have imagined, right? And that racists have imagined, and that landlords have imagined, etc. And I think I guess for me, there has to be a sort of theoretical, when we do this speculation that is oriented towards winning, whether it's in organizing form or in writing form, and I agree that they're not the same, they don't have the same impact on the world. This question of what do we already know about the world, and what have we tried, and what have we failed, and how do we take these lessons in, and being able to emerge from a space of kind of dogma to a space of experimentation. And I think that that's, going back to this idea of the muscle that speculative fiction builds. We're in a fight for the future, right? Like that's the thing about the fact that the right is speculating. In the US we had Project 2025, and that was a piece of speculative fiction, right? That was absolutely a piece of speculative fiction about the future. And so then the question becomes, so to kind of build on what we've been saying, it becomes like that our speculative fiction isn't just meant to just exist for its own existence. It needs to be like fighting ready, right? Like it needs to be ready to emerge in a world in which it is in a fight. Its very existence on its own, right, is not enough. It is, but I do think it is an important part, right, of the process. And so we need to think about these ideas as both that the idea itself needs to compete in the world, right? But also that it needs what is the kind of material reality, to use a standard kind of organizer phrase, the terrain of struggle that we're entering, right? So I often find myself in organizing spaces where people are like, revolution or bust, right? And I'm like, okay, so we go out and we're ready for the revolution, and there's 30 of us and the state kills us all, right? Like what next? So I think, so I'm not offering a very coherent argument here. I'm trying to pull together some of the threads that we've been talking about, but I think that basically we need to orient around ourselves we need to orient around the future as something that we're fighting for, right? And that's why I like this phrasing of winning, right? That it's not just gonna exist like by virtue of our existence. Unfortunately, it is actually something you need resistance, right? And you need fighting, and you need to think through like what's going to work. And I think part of it, I mean, to build on what Ama was saying, is about recognizing our own personal histories, right? I think there was a moment for me as someone who watched the Arab Spring happen, and it was this like moment of being like, holy shit, like this is it, right? And the like failure of that, and my own family, I had family get exiled from, I'm half Egyptian, and I had family get exiled from Egypt, and that place, which was an anchoring place for me, became, and we lost property, and we lost and this sense that like this was a place that was home and then was taken away. And especially as someone who, my other half is Palestinian, so I was like, it's on every side. But, and there was a moment in my life where I would say, well, I'm never going to recover. Like, I'm never going to feel the kind of hope that I felt, in that moment. Like, I will never be whole again, right? Having watched this. And am I glad I was wrong. I'm so glad I was wrong, right? And what made me feel that hope again was 2020, right? And even before 2020, being on the street for Eric Garner, like in 2016 and 2017, like, the uprising in Ferguson, and leading up and seeing in 2020 this moment. And it's true that again, we were defeated, right? But I had an experience of defeat at that point. And I felt like my role became, it was like, oh, I've been here before. I know what this is like. It's like your first breakup, right? Your first breakup, you're like, I'll never love again. And then you're like, and then your second breakup, you're like, man, that was devastating. But I've been here before, and I remember that I was able to love again. And so I think that like there's this way that we have to transition like that, and then now, right, with the encampments, and there was this moment of like, we are freeing Palestine right now. And I kind of got to be that elder that was like, I will never be the person who's like, probably not yet, because I want you to feel the full weight of that moment. And I will be the elder who is still here when we face the inevitable ebb moment and the defeat moment. And I'm here to tell you that we're going to spend our whole life in struggle, and that this is part of the life cycle of being people committed to liberation, right? And the reason I'm saying all that is to say that there's an element of like of being able to flex for different roles as well. I think that's part of the ingredients, right? Is being able to like to move as a movement, to move as writers, like with change and facing the world, but also recognizing that we're going to play different roles and we're going to play different life roles across our life courses, which is a lot to say that I don't have a specific answer to your question. But those are, here's an amalgamation of thoughts.
Yeah, no worries at all. I think the point that you've made about I've been here before, I mean, it kind of also speaks to what you're doing, Yara, in terms of we've been here before. And that's, I guess, why history is so kind of ripe for examining and also reimagining as well. So do you want to also answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, two things that were mentioned by Ama and Yaman that I think are really important, I really agree with, are that this long view of time. Um, and I think that's why I get frustrated with some of the very specific language around claims of what science fiction can do, because I'm like, no, historical fiction also does this. And it's actually, it's quite, it would be more helpful if we thought of fiction as a whole rather than one genre, like the inherent qualities of fiction. Because a lot of what Amma has described is exactly what my novel was trying to do, which is to say, these characters don't know how their struggles are going to relate, but you do. And so, that's how I'm using the dramatic irony inherent to the fiction, is to say they're taking a leap of faith and it works out, but they don't. Anyway, so I think, and so just to go back to what are the oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to echo is that I think strategy is so important, and I guess like part of the end of history, like capitalist realism era that most of us sort of come of age in, is that you kind of pragmatism became a kind of dirty word. But actually, I don't want to be, I'm not giving up and winning. I would like to win some stuff right now and some really big stuff after I'm dead. But so I think those are two really, really important things, is you can be incredibly expansive in your political horizon and you can be very seriously pragmatic, which is very much how I operate. And how we won the stuff that we won, for example, with the writers that I was organizing, is by really operating like trade union organizers and making sure that we every single worker that was going to the festival had been given the chance to withdraw and effectively organized a wildcat strike. So yeah, and I guess a little bit about the work that I'm doing now about, yeah, so I think something else that struck me is that I have learned so much as an organizer the more I have organized. So I have just learned like what works, what doesn't work. And I also think that's why it's so important for us to be internationalists and be looking at struggles around the world and be reading our history, because then we understand what has worked and what hasn't worked before. And of course, the situations that we face are always new. But there's so much for us to already be learning from that is available to us. And I just want to talk about a little bit about some organizing that I've been doing recently, which is that I lived in London nearly my whole life. And then I moved to the northeast of England. I lived just outside Newcastle. And I think most of the people on this call are from the UK, but if anyone's from the US, it's like a poorer, like post-industrial part of the UK. In general, it's whiter, but in the cities, it's still quite mixed. And I've done some of the most rewarding organizing I've done in my life, which has been ahead of our local elections, which were in May. Every Saturday for sort of 3 or 4 months before, I was going door knocking in areas where Reform, who are kind of like UK MAGA, were going to win, getting them to vote for my friend, who is a socialist. And he won in the local elections and he came first. And, you know, it's so important to go and be with people who disagree with, to go and be ambitious about like what you can win and be systematic and be deeply ideological, but also deeply pragmatic. Um, and I see a lot of work happening in London, which is people who agree with each other, talking to each other about how much they agree. Um, but I've never felt like more satisfaction almost than when my friend got elected. And also because I think it's part of the abolitionist in me, which is like we actually don't give up on people just because they believe harmful things or do harmful things. And like what we were seeing in those areas is kind of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore called organized abandonment. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of wanted to bring that in as well because doing that often feels quite different to doing creative writing and actually hard to really I almost yeah, so I guess I don't know, maybe I shouldn't go into how it makes me feel about my writing and how I spend my time, but that's something that I have learned a lot from doing recently. And yeah, we're going to keep winning and get rid of reform in Walker. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Ama, do you want to also take the question before we open up to the audience?
Not really. And if we don't and reform get in, we'll still be here, right? I feel like that's also the point. Um, and I think I was really inspired by the feminists of color organizers in the US who were like, yeah, okay, Trump got reelected. The state was never going to free us, so we carry on. And I really appreciated that response, and I've been trying to hold that in preparation whilst thinking about all the strategies to not get reform in so that I'm less crushed. And I love this idea of maybe 2020 was my first heartbreak. Maybe it was. This is a helpful way of thinking about it, having been in it from the build up from to 2015. I think this is an interesting way of thinking about it. I I think that something that's interesting about fictioning is also thinking about building kind of matrix type simulation rooms to test things out. And this is one of the ways that I try and kind of market it as useful to my undergrads is what are some ideas that you might want to experiment with in a place where you're going to do very little harm, right? I mean, they're not publishing these stories. So you're not walking into a room and saying, here are people and let's talk about all your trauma and let's try and workshop the future, right? But let's think about this as a kind of potential simulation for trying things out. And I think Le Guin is like the kind of archetype of this, right? As Yara's already mentioned. Building on movements that are happening, but also like sitting in the cabin at the end of her garden and being like, but what if this really, really happened? And what would this completely communist existence mean for hermits? How would they live within real communist society and providing a kind of space where that diligence is required. And I think that if you're doing world building as a gym practice, as a real muscle building practice, then it's not just, oh, beautiful, and now everyone's gonna fly. What does that mean for the other things that are flying around? What does that mean for the food chain? What does that mean for the ecology? Who else is really at stake? And I think that there can be loads that could absolutely open up a whole space of irritating navel gazing where you're spending a week talking about, oh, is this the right use of the word nature? And who the hell does that help? But it can also open up, well, what do I really mean when I talk about something that's being natural and as a natural or not natural? And how does that change how I interact with the people that I'm organizing with? Because organizing is, yes, it can be about talking to people who you disagree with, but it's also people who you agree with about the big things. But how do you actually get through the day to day of, well, I disagree about whether or not we need to provide childcare at this event or not because of this and this and this, and how do we navigate that with all the trauma that's in the room? And I think actually creating a kind of resilience for that minutia almost, and thinking through it and knowing what to let go of and knowing what to stay with, it can be a really useful practice. Um, both solo and world and collectively, because also we're talking about writing predominantly here in this conversation as a solo practice, right? Again, this is a totally Western capitalist idea of the writer artist genius who is alone at the end of their garden writing their big novel that changes the world. But actually writing and speculative fictioning can be a collective practice. It can be a practice for organizing. It can be a practice for working through conflict. It can be a practice for working through despair. And I think that we see that being modeled amazingly by, people like Adrian Marie Brown and many others, but we also are not doing it enough, not using it enough, which I think is one of the reasons why migrants in culture is so useful. And also, I just want to kind of reaffirm, which was my initial answer to this question, the idea that we maybe have everything that we need. Maybe we have everything that we need. Maybe what we need isn't in the future or out there. It's certainly not technological, but maybe it's not something that we need to go out and find. Maybe we have everything that we need. And I guess one of the reasons why I am not willing to throw out the idea that writing can be as impactful as organizing is because movements have happened because of writing. And because we see certain texts being made unavailable, and not only do we see texts being made not available to potential organizers, we see the literacy rate of everyone being hugely affected globally. I was in an amazing workshop led by Lola Olufemi last year, and one of the things that one of the participants raised when she asked, what is the thing that you feel is really like the real crisis of our generation? And this guy said, I think it's Black literacy. And I was like, would never have even occurred to me that this was the thing. And he made this kind of whole argument about people but through reading the Bible and through different kind of literacy projects, people had a real commitment to understanding that through becoming literate led some kind of emancipation, and that liberation wasn't kind of possible without it, and that's completely fallen off the agenda. And I've been thinking really deeply about it, and we think about the kinds of communities that are consistently provided with less supportive schooling, consistently with a huge issue with young boys of color, for example, lots of people of color, but especially boys of color being kicked out of schools at the moment in the UK. So thinking about who is able to sit down and read a revolutionary text and have it change their life. And so I think also there is a question here about, it's not just about the speculating, but who has access to the speculating and how we're doing that collectively and using that as a tool to not provide the fish, but sew the nets together.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like I don't have anything to add, but that was just such an important point. I think we have about 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So we have got some questions in the chat already, and please do continue to send them. So the first question, thank you for your beautiful readings. I've just finished Isabella Hamad's pamphlet called Recognizing the Stranger, and I wonder how you engage with her critique of recognition and narratives. In other words, are stories and writing them of any use in times of genocide?
I mean, I'll maybe take this question. I think in a way, so I think in some ways the kind of tension between is writing itself enough, or do we also need to be organizing, we could kind of infuse it in answering this question. I actually I have the book on my shelf. So actually, Ama and Yara, if you've read it, maybe I would rather you take the question.
I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's on my shelf, but I haven't read it yet. So I would only be answering the kind of last part of the question, or not in reference to the text. Yara, do you want to say anything?
I did read it, but I read it when she originally published it in the Paris Review, which was a couple of years ago. But I've read her work, and no, I guess, well, yeah, we organized together. Sorry, you've all frozen. Hopefully you can still hear me.
We can still hear you, although you have frozen.
Horribly, hopefully not in a very unflattering position. I mean, I think what she is engaging with is a question we haven't really touched on. And again, she's coming from a literary studies like novelist perspective, which is a little bit different, maybe from how we've been approaching this. But I think there are questions she's asking which are around the power of fiction and its relationship to difference and universality, that I think are really interesting. Particularly, I think for me anyway, when I started organizing, there was a lot of identity politics and kind of I was organizing in all women's spaces or like spaces without men, for the first half of my 20s. And what I think now is actually men are fine as long as you give them quite strict rules. But it's good to have strict rules in any organizing spaces, actually, so people know how to behave. Anyway, but certainly, like, particularly where the kind of defining moral question of the last few years has been, well, do you acknowledge the universality, the universal value of human life or not? I think this question of, well, what does it take to recognize a stranger? What does it take to recognize the universality of the stranger? And can fiction do that? And it engages with these liberal questions of, because there are all these terrible liberals that won't do BDS, but they'll claim that their novel helps humanize like whatever marginalized group, and bring people together. And there was that, terrible judge in the UK that wanted, I mean, look, I don't want to send people to prison. And I think the justice system is really fucked up, but I don't think prescribing Jane Austen is also, a way to civilize people, which is what this guy was doing. So I don't know, I guess for me, what is interesting about what Isabella Hamad is asking is how do we do universality without being liberals? And I think that is a really interesting question. And it's something that I try and work through in my own fiction. But in terms of, well, yeah, I mean, I do think there is a huge power in writing. I also think writing should be done for its own sake, right? Like even when it's not instrumentalized. I'm very interested in instrumentalizing writing, but it isn't only done for instrumental reasons. We also do it for beauty and because we want to like somebody was saying, lie on the grass and enjoy a poem. So yes, I suppose I would just say write your poems and join a union. Like that's just what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add to that I think that, and I mean, I think one of the questions was about how do you find work and how do you find work that's aligned? And, one of the ways that I think about this is that like, I happen to be one of these really, lucky people who got an academic job and who has like a job that allows me to think and write. And a lot of the writing I do is not speculative. I mean, I still kind of have I have like two kind of writing jobs, right? I write standard sociological, like mainstream academia. But I think a lot about like what would my relationship be to politics if I didn't have this like upwardly mobile thing, right? Like my mom, when she moved to the US, like she worked as a home health aide, and she had this rich like community and political life that had nothing to do with her work. And so to me, like those two things, and I think a lot about like, okay, if I were a manual laborer or if I worked in the service industry, or I would still have a political life, right? Because I'm engaged, like, and I wouldn't assume that my day-to-day work, right, of like was itself the political contribution that I was making. I would see my work as an instrument to the political contribution that I was making by joining a union, forming a union, or like joining a service workers alliance or whatever. And I would have like a broader political commitment. And I think that for writing, I think that we have this special thing where sometimes the writing can be politically instrumental. And I completely agree that like, especially when we think about particular communities, I mean, I do a lot of like free university type stuff. I don't see my work in itself on its own as the political contribution, right? It has to be a combination. I think the other thing to think about is that we all have different roles to play. And again, we play them at different moments in the life course. So yeah, that's just my addition to that.
Thanks so much. I'm just aware of time, so I'm going to try
Yeah, sorry.
and kind of like no, not at all. I'm just going to try and summarize a couple of the questions together, and then maybe people can just jump in and, on which ones speak to them. So there's a question from someone who's an economist by training, where they talk about how around the Green New Deal in the US, respectable economists wouldn't go on the record to project what a 10-year plan to address the Anthropocene crisis would entail. And so the question is about how time is implicated in speculative future writing. There's a question about whether speculative writing can help us to enjoy a more mature winning. In Syria, the Assad regime was toppled at a time when we almost gave up, and now there's a new government which doesn't seem to care about what the Syrian revolution called for 15 years ago. There's a question about language. If some people don't think in English, how can we write speculative stories about a world without prisons using a totally different language logic? English always wants to find a villain to punish. How can untranslatable words and other ways of thinking show us a fresh way of community healing that English grammar cannot even imagine? Should we maybe do those, and then if there's time, I'll do a couple more at the end.
I just want to do a quick shout out to my dear friend and wonderful comrade, Mahmoud El Sayed's The Republic of Memory, which is a really fabulous new piece of Arab futurism. I love it so much. That works really amazingly around language, I think, and thinks about kind of revolutionary movements happening on a spaceship across language, on a ship that's organized not by race or creed, but by language. I also maybe just want to speak to the question about how we fund our lives, which Eman just touched on a little bit, and how we fund our work, because I think it's something that I'm finding a lot harder than I did 2 years ago. With the way the arts funding has been slashed, with the way that no one is hiring Black writers and Black academics, and all our Black studies, centers are being closed down, and also having returned from having had a baby a year ago, or 18 months ago. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the ways that we are things in some ways things are a lot harder for us than they were 30 years ago, when none of us would have had assimilatable jobs, right? None of us would have been in the university. None of us would have owned houses. None of us would have had free childcare. We all would have been organizing all those things independently. And we wouldn't be so bought into the state as we are. We wouldn't have so much to lose in terms of the totally precarious and conditional security that the state provides. So I think that there are ways in which we can think about being really, I mean, I've never really gotten over positionality as something that needs to be named. I think in organizing, certainly in writing spaces and academia, but I think really knowing who you're standing next to and thinking about who you are when you're showing up is really important. Are you showing up as a what my friend calls a writer with a patron partner, aka a partner who's funding their writing career, which is a lot of people that wouldn't say that. But that is how their writing is being funded, all their organizing is being funded, all their art practice is being funded, a patron partner or parent, etc. So I think finding ways to really be transparent about the resources that we have access to, whether they're familial or institutional or inherited, and to think about redistributing that kind of security, but also to think about, well, what does that mean in terms of what I need to be willing to give up and what I need to be willing to do with my time? And so I think that we need a new wave of languages for how we talk about privilege and proximity to power, and being transparent about that. Being transparent and really, somebody said recently that like shame is a useless emotion. So we just need to stop doing that and start thinking practically about how we redistribute resources, and a lot of those resources are temporal. And so I think that's something that I really want to kind of say about how different practices are being funded, whether they're artistic or movement based.
I can
Just to
try.
recap, so the questions are about how you fund your work or how you find work, about time in speculative writing, about whether speculative writing can help our writing to be more mature, and on writing in languages other than English.
My writing is bilingual, so I can just talk quickly to that one. So yeah, I've written these two novels. They're both obviously mostly in English, because they would never be published otherwise. But there's quite a lot in Portuguese, and in the second one, there's like very important plot point, which is only revealed in English like a few pages after, which I didn't want to put it in English at all, but then I thought maybe that would be better. But what I would just slightly challenge about the assumptions in your question is I think it's incredibly pessimistic to say that English can't imagine like a world without a villain or without punishment. I think English absolutely can. And like we can't give up on the English language, unfortunately. It's too pessimistic and huge, and it's also too much ours, you know? It doesn't just belong to the imperialists and the colonialists who brought it around the world. It also belongs to all the people who it's their main language, not by choice. So we have to take English and make it do what we want. And I absolutely think that can be done. And one of the ways of doing that might be by introducing new vocabulary from other languages. But that's something that we've always done. And there's some Brazilian modernist theorists who talk about cannibalism, as a kind of process through which we take what we have, and we digest it and shit it out in the way that we want it to be. So that also, yeah, that might be a useful theoretical framework.
Thanks so much. Eman, did you want to jump in on the time question?
Yeah, I love that you noticed the timing of everything. We wanted to write a novel that was really accountable to us and to our community, our organizing communities. And so that's part of why we put it in, like, we imagine ourselves as surviving this transition, because part of the novel is enormous amounts of trauma and violence, in that transition, right? Like, it doesn't happen easily. It's not that like capitalism, like we all write one change.org petition and then capitalism ends. Like, wouldn't that be great? There's like the state falls, markets fall, there's enormous trauma along the way. And we wanted to be accountable to that rather than just kind of write it into a future that we weren't a part of. So I do think that and I think it's really sick. And you allude to this in your question, the way that certain liberal, and also neoconservative, and especially these like tech bros, are like escaping the reality of the present by like thinking, they're like, oh no, you have a presentist bias if you're not thinking 10,000 years into the future, as though they are somehow good stewards of that future, which they're absolutely not. But also it's a way to avoid accountability for like the horrific realities of the present and the near future. So I do think that that's an important part of writing. I think long-term writing is good too. Again, there's not a moral, like, the question is, what are the political commitments of that writing? What are the liberatory commitments of it? But certainly I do think that near future writing is really important, not exclusively so, but it can offer a lot of political potential.
Thanks so much. I also realized that I don't think I've read out one of the crucial parts of that question, which was that the questioner said that they found one of the elements that was really liberating about Everything for Everyone was the fact that it all took place in a time frame that was within our lifetime. So that was central to that question. I think we've kind of run out of time. So should I hand it back to you, Junlin, for just closing?
Yeah. Just there was one other question on writing exercises, and I'll just put into the chat, if I can. There's an abolition science fiction collection that's got workshop exercises that you can do. And hopefully out of Saturday School, we will pull together more exercises that can be used specifically for organizers that want to win. But thank you so much for this like totally engrossing conversation. I was trying to take notes whilst my computer was bouncing and my screen was doing this little jiggle. It was so thoroughly enjoyable, and we'll have a recording so we can all like feast on that again because there was so much to take away. Thank you, Ama, Yara, and Eman, and Farhaana for hosting tonight, and for everyone for making it today.